Okay. Well, I I got to see this view, and I got to see that view 5 different trips to space, and I've I've been fond of telling, okay, how in the world did I get there in the first place? Well, I had a real big advantage. I grew up in a flying family. This is mom and dad. And interesting thing about this photo is that this is not dad's airplane. This is mom's airplane. My mother and 2 of her girlfriends from teachers college decided they wanted to learn to fly, so they bought this airplane, a Taylor Cub, the forerunner of the Piper Cub, and I think they paid $900 for it. And so that's how she met my dad, and that's how I had this big advantage of growing up in a flying family. So I have lots of pictures like this one of my older brother John and I playing on an airport that at the time my dad was managing in Cooperstown, New York. Dad was an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot. And I knew from the time I was about 10 years old that I wanted to be my dad. I wanted to be just like him. So I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot. And fortunately, I guess I was pretty good at math. So I made it through aeronautical engineering, uh, into the Navy right out of college, and went through pilot training. And I guess I did well in pilot training because they awarded me my very first choice, which was F-4 Phantoms out of San Diego, California, out of Miramar Naval Air Station, and flying the F-4 Phantom. And this was my squadron, the Fighter Squadron 111, the Sundowners. Flying from an aircraft carrier was really exciting because you went from this position in about 4.5 seconds, and you're going 175 miles an hour when you get to here. So really an exciting thing to do. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the airplanes because I know we want to talk space, but I came back from that deployment to Southeast Asia, and my squadron sent me to Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun. And so after just having one deployment, I guess they decided I was worthy of going through Top Gun. So I did. And that's been described as a graduate course in fighter aviation and fighter tactics and fighter weaponry. And of course, the movie made it all very famous. But I've got to tell you, when I was there at Top Gun, this was 1972, October of 1972, there wasn't anybody there who looked anything like Kelly McGillis. But I guess that's fair because none of us were ever as good looking as Tom Cruise either. And speaking of Tom Cruise, in the movie, of course, he flew the airplane that I flew after I flew F-14, after I flew the F-4 Phantom, and that was F-14 Tomcats. I was in the first operational squadron, and it was almost a little depressing because at the time, the F-4 Phantom was the world's best all-around fighter. And all of a sudden, the F-14 Tomcat came out, and anything the Phantom could do, the Tomcat did 20% better. It out accelerated it, out climbed it. It had this variable sweep wing on it, which in this photo, and this is actually my airplane, I'm going to see if I can point at up here on the cockpit, it says Lieutenant Bob Gibson. They wouldn't let me put Hoot on it, so I had to just settle for Lieutenant Bob Gibson. In this picture, the wings are swept all the way forward, and then for supersonic flight, high-speed flight, we could sweep the wings all the way aft, and it sure did make it a cool-looking airplane, and it helped. It helped with supersonic drag. Of course, for coming back to that great big giant aircraft carrier, we'd sweep the wings all the way forward. We had full span leading edge slats and full span trailing edge flaps. And so for a Mach 2.4 jet fighter, we came aboard the carrier at 125 knots, so about 135 miles an hour, which is really slow for a jet fighter of that kind of performance. And you had a really cool view when you got in close. And of course, this is what you saw. And gee, I'm going to get stopped in that distance. Yeah, you'd better. And you can see it's kind of tight landing area. You had airplanes and people on the right-hand side and airplanes and people on the left-hand side. So you had to be very accurate. Well, after my cruise in the Tomcats, so at this point I had 3 deployments to Southeast Asia, 3 cruises. I got selected for Navy test pilot school. So that was the other big half of my dream, that I get to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot. Well, graduating from test pilot school was the one big thing that really qualified me to get selected by NASA. And so I was selected in the first group of space shuttle astronauts in 1978. And there were 35 of us. That was the largest astronaut class NASA had ever picked. And of course, we needed a whole bunch of astronauts because we're going to start operating the space shuttles, and we're going to fly as many as 8 or 9 missions a year. And so all of a sudden, we needed a whole lot of astronauts. Well, I joined them in 1978. I didn't get to go to space my first time until 1984. So what in the world did I do all that time? Well, we worked on a number of different projects. I worked in the software verification laboratory. I worked as the deputy chief of aircraft operations for NASA as well. And one of the really fun things that I got to do was I got to be a chase plane pilot for the first 2 shuttle launches. And this is a photo of the chase crew for the very first shuttle launch. And what we did to train for that, because we had to be able to capture the space shuttle at an altitude that we could reach, and also at a speed that we could reach in our T-38 chase planes. We had enlarged speed brakes on those airplanes, so we could generate the kind of drag that a space shuttle generated. And what we would do is we would have one of our 3 airplanes simulate a space shuttle and fly the ground track and the profile of the space shuttle, and that would be the airplane on the left in this picture. And then chase 1 would be the airplane on the right. And so we'd have to fly the intercept and be at that point in space at exactly the right time, because the space shuttle's not going to slow down and wait for us. So this was pretty challenging to make sure you were there at the right time. And this is the configuration we had to get our T-38 chase plane into in order to be able to stay with the shuttle. So it would be full speed brakes with those enlarged speed brakes, landing gear down, and you can't really see it, but 40% speed brakes in order to have enough drag. And we would fly all the way down to the simulated touchdown. And here it's at Edwards Air Force Base out on the lake bed, because the shuttle was landing on lake bed runway 23. And so what we have in the foreground is chase 2, who had a TV cameraman in the back seat. And then far away, you can see chase 1 simulating, or chase 1 chasing our simulated space shuttle for touchdown. Well, in order to practice for catching a really fast space shuttle coming back into land, we ran simulated intercepts on the fastest airplane in the world at the time, the SR-71 Blackbird. And he couldn't do Mach 9 or Mach 10 or anything like that, but they could do Mach 3. And so we trained to be at the point in time for the intercept against the SR-71 Blackbird. So that was pretty exciting to get to do that. Well, I was airborne at Cape Canaveral overhead, and I'm the airplane. You can just barely see my T-38 in this picture. This photo was taken from chase 2, and I'm chase 1, and the shuttle has lifted off, and we're there just in case they had, for example, an engine malfunction and had to do a return to launch site abort, an RTLS. And we would chase them down to touchdown and be able to check their landing gear and give them a cross check on their airspeed and their altitude and all of that. And then come 2 days later, here I am joining up on Columbia at about 20,000 feet as it is making the approach into land. And this photo was taken by astronaut Kathy Sullivan, who was in my back seat as I was joining up on Columbia. And we chased them all the way down to touchdown, and I would give them an airspeed and an altitude check. And then approaching touchdown, As a backup for their radar altimeter, I would call off main gear touchdown height, and then once they touch down, which they are in this photo, I would call off the nose gear touchdown height for them as well. And it's good that we were doing that because on SDS-1, the radar altimeter locked on the nose gear. And so it read something like 9 feet. So that wasn't useful at all. So it was good that we had a chase plane. Well, come the 10th shuttle launch, it was my turn to go to space. I flew as the co-pilot on my first mission, and this was aboard Challenger. And we had an 8-day mission. We took 2 commercial satellites to space and deployed both of those. And we were up for 8 days, and we made the very first landing back at Cape Canaveral. But the thing we are most remembered for was the untethered spacewalks, the world's first untethered spacewalks. And in this photo is Bruce McCandless, who was the very first astronaut ever to fly free in space because he has a rocket pack on his back and he has 2 controllers. He has a translation controller and an attitude controller. And I was one of only 3 people left inside the shuttle while they were out on the spacewalks. There were 2 spacewalkers, Bruce McCandless and Bob Stewart. And the commander was Vance Brand. And he and Ron McNair, Mission Specialist 1, were on board the shuttle along with me. And during the spacewalk, I didn't have anything to do. So I was parked at the window with a camera. And I got some pretty spectacular photos. And you've probably seen this photo before. And it never, ever says on it, photo by Hooter or photo by Hoot Gibson. It just says NASA photo. But I'm the one that got these photos. And I shot this picture when Bruce McCandless, and I can tell it's him because he has the red stripes on his spacesuit on his legs. And our other spacewalker, Bob Stewart, he didn't have red stripes, so that's how we could tell them apart when they had their gold visor down to protect their eyes against the sun. They used their rocket pack to fly pretty far away from the space shuttle. And we can see they are not tethered. And I get the question all the time, well, what if they had run out of fuel while they were all the way out there, or if they had an electrical malfunction on their rocket pack? Well, we practiced to rescue them, and we had a procedure already written in place that we would use if we had to do that, and everything worked just fine. We could fly Challenger over to them, pick them up. Well, as I mentioned, we were up for 8 days. We came back and we made the very first landing back at Cape Canaveral. This again was the 10th launch of a space shuttle. And this was the first time that the weather and everything all cooperated to where we could bring a shuttle back down to land at Cape Canaveral. And of course, I always wanted to land there at the Cape because it saved a lot of expense in transporting the orbiter from California back to Florida. It saved the risk of exposing it to the weather and all of that in doing that. So I always preferred to land at Cape Canaveral. So we made the very first landing there. That was February the 11th, 1984. So I'm rapidly approaching the 40th anniversary of that next month. Well, for my second mission, I got to be the mission commander, and I had a 7-person crew on that mission. And one of the really interesting people on the crew was, I'm circling him with my pointer, was United States Congressman Bill Nelson, who flew with us because NASA had invited the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Space to fly aboard the shuttle, and the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Space. And Bill was the House Committee chairman on space. So he came with us on Columbia, and he went on, like I say, to be a senator later on. And today, he is the head of NASA. He is the NASA administrator. I'm predicting that he will be a particularly effective NASA administrator because he knows the workings of Washington, D.C., and the Congress and the Senate, but he also understands space because he's actually been an astronaut. Well, we launched on January the 12th, 1986, in the dark, because that was what fit for our launch window and our satellite deployment windows. And here's a photo 2 minutes after launch, and I can tell it's 2 minutes because the smoke trail from the booster rockets has dissipated, which means we burned them out, and we're getting ready to separate those. And of course, here's what's happening at booster separation. And it feels like a train wreck is what it feels like, because there are big explosive bolts that we fire that separate the booster rockets from us. And then you can see there are thrusters on the nose and the tail of the booster rockets that push them away from us, because once we cut them loose, we don't want to recontact them. That would be catastrophic. So that was what booster separation looked like. We deployed one satellite on that mission, and we had a number of science experiments that we were doing. We had 2 ultraviolet telescopes in the cargo bay, and we were maneuvering Columbia to point the payload bay, and therefore our 2 ultraviolet telescopes at different objects like the Andromeda Galaxy and clear regions in different galaxies. And so we had a whole lot of experiments. We tried to come home after only 5 days, and the weather didn't cooperate. So we waved off for a day. We tried again the next day. The weather didn't cooperate. Finally, Mission Control said, guys, we give up. Take it one more orbit, bring it into Edwards Air Force Base, because the weather had been sucked in at the Cape the whole time. So we wound up landing before sunrise in California. And this was only the second time that we had landed a space shuttle at night. So for my first trip as a mission commander and my first landing, got to do an unplanned night landing. Now we could see this coming. And so my co-pilot and I had trained mostly at night, because if you can land it at night, you certainly can land it in the daytime. So we were actually prepared. And as I mentioned, this was only the second time we had landed a space shuttle at night. This was January the 18th, 1986. 10 days later, we lost the Challenger and her entire crew. It took us nearly 3 years, took us over 2 years to, number one, investigate what happened. Why did we have this failure? Number two, okay, figure out how we're going to redesign and then incorporate all the redesign, and then do all the ground-based testing to verify everything before we would be ready to launch again. So it wasn't until September of 1988 that we launched Discovery for the first time after the Challenger accident. And I got selected to command the second launch when we started up again. And this was in December of 1988. Unfortunately, to this day, I can't talk about it a whole lot. It was a top secret classified mission aboard Atlantis. And as you can see, we had an all military crew, and we trained for a year, and we launched December the 2nd of 1988. And we went to space, and because this was a top secret classified mission, it just coincidentally took us way up north over the Soviet Union. So yeah, that was just coincidentally. So we got to take this photo, and I can't show very many photos from that mission, other than Earth photos, because to this day I have not been given authorization to say what we did, other than I'm able to say that we deployed a major new intelligence satellite using the space shuttle's robot arm to lift it out of the cargo bay. We separated away from it, and there was a problem with it. We had to do an unplanned re-rendezvous with it and help fix it. And that's about as much as I'm allowed to say about the payload. But we took this photo over northern Russia of the world's largest lake. This is Lake Baikal in Russia. And the reason it's the world's largest lake is that from this end of the lake, which is the southeastern end of the lake, to the northeastern end of the lake is 400 miles. But that's not why it's the world's largest lake. It's also 1 mile deep because it's at the junction of two of Earth's tectonic plates. So 20%, 1/5 of all the fresh water on Earth is in that one lake, is in Lake Baikal. Well, this was the shortest mission that I flew. We were only 4.5 days. We had a planned landing on the lake bed out at Edwards Air Force Base because after the Challenger accident, we determined that we didn't know as much about this vehicle as we needed to know. So we went back into flight test mode. So flight test mode says, get it airborne or out of airborne, get it above airborne, get it in space, do what we're there to do, evaluate as much as we can in a minimum duration flight, get it back down on the ground so we can inspect it and check it all thoroughly before we launch the next mission. So this was only 4.5 days. Well, I had to wait a couple more years for my next trip to space, but that was okay because I had flown my third mission before most of the pilots in my class had flown their second mission. So I had to wait a few more years before I got to go again, but I did get to go again. And this time it was aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. And this was the 50th launch of a space shuttle. And we were a dedicated science mission. And the mission was funded by Japan. And so we took the first professional Japanese astronaut to space, Dr. Mamoru Mori, who's back here in the space lab. And what we're doing in this photo is we're doing a shift change. We were working 24 hours a day. So I split my crew up into the red crew and the blue crew. And every 12 hours, we would hand off from red to blue or blue to red. And we're doing a review right now of what got accomplished in the previous 12-hour session and handing off to the oncoming crew. And you can see, I like to show this picture because it shows the high-tech method that we use to keep ourselves in one spot. You'll notice there aren't any chairs or any seats back here in the lab. We don't have any use for chairs because you don't need to sit down and rest because you haven't been standing. You have been floating freely in space the entire time. And so you don't need to sit down and rest. So we have no use for it. So what we have is, you can see down on the bottom of the photo, we have these foot loops. And that's all you need to keep yourself in one spot so that then you will have both hands free. So I'm taking notes in my notebook about what we accomplished. It's also very handy to be weightless because when I need to turn the page, I can just let go of my pen and let it float right there in front of me, flip the page, and then grab the pen out of midair and continue to write on the next page. So it's really handy to be weightless. You just have to remember when you come back and land that, okay, you're not weightless anymore, so you can't do that. At least not one of my crew members, but on a different flight, one of the crew members was signing an autograph book and he parked his pen in front of him, flipped the page and looked around and his pen was gone. Didn't understand why. Well, we were up for 8 days on that mission. We had more than 40 different material sciences and life sciences experiments. And for one example, we built the largest single crystal of indium antimonide that had ever been built, because you can propagate a melt zone in a crystal and therefore arrive at a single crystal much bigger than you can down here on Earth, because gravity would tend to topple your melt zone and it would fall apart. But in weightlessness, we could propagate a melt zone on a really big crystal. So we did a number of things like that, and also life sciences research in addition. Well, 8 days later, we came back and landed at Cape Canaveral, and again, this was the 50th launch of a space shuttle. Well, we just have to look at a couple photos of Earth, because one of the big thrills of going to space, besides just the launch itself and the trip to orbit, is the views of the Earth. And this was a photo we took on my third mission, and it's of the world's largest island, Greenland. And again, this was December of 1988, and you can kind of make out some contrails in this picture. Anytime we were up over the northern hemisphere, we would see contrails everywhere, lots and lots of contrails, especially over the Atlantic Ocean from air traffic between Europe and the United States. Another cool photo that we shot on my fourth mission was over the delta of the Nile River. And in this photo, we're looking straight down. North is to the top of this photo. And of course, the Nile River flows from south to north. And the only thing from space that looks gray or silver colored are cities. And so right here at the tip of the delta, this is Cairo, Egypt. Under the tail of the orbiter, this is the Suez Canal, which has been much in the news lately because of trouble in the Red Sea, which of course the Suez Canal lets shipping sail from the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal and into the Red Sea. I guess we're going to have to clean up that mess that's going on in the Red Sea so that the Suez Canal can start flowing again. An interesting little white spot here right next to Cairo, those are the pyramids. And so if you know right where to look, you can spot those from space because they do stand out just a little bit. Well, the next picture is this same area at night. And so not only do we have this fascinating view of the Earth in the daytime, we get to enjoy it at night as well. And it's really remarkable in this photo. You look along the Nile River, and in the delta of the Nile River, there sure is a lot of civilization living along the river and in the delta, and that's because we humans badly need water. And so where there's water, there's us. And where there's not water, there's not many of us. So lots of people living along the Nile River, and I have no clue who this is out here. But you guys sure are out there on your own, out there in the Sahara Desert. So this is kind of a pretty photo. Oh, and one of the things visible in this picture, this light colored green glow on the horizon, is Earth's atmosphere. At night, it takes on just a little bit of the ambient lighting, and it forms what we astronauts refer to as the air glow. And it's about 80 miles thick. And so that's what makes it possible for we humans to live here on the Earth. This is kind of pretty, but the prettiest thing that we get to see from orbit is the northern lights and the southern lights. Now, most of us here in America, of course, are aware of and accustomed to the northern lights, the aurora borealis. But this is, I believe, a photo of the southern lights, the aurora australis. And each of these is a ring of light around the poles, around the North Pole and around the South Pole. And it is just fascinating to watch. You can kind of see in this photo that we are looking down at the aurora because it's happening at the top of Earth's atmosphere. And we are above Earth's atmosphere. So we look down at the aurora. So really a fascinating view. Well, one more flight to bore you with. For my final flight, my crew and I trained over here. I wasn't planning on doing a fifth mission. After my fourth trip to space, I was the most experienced pilot astronaut, so I was appointed to the position of chief astronaut. So I figured for the rest of my time at NASA, I would finish it up as the leader of the astronauts. NASA had other thoughts, and they made me step down from being chief astronaut to command the first docking that a space shuttle ever did, and it was with the Russian space station Mir. So that's why my crew and I had to train in Russia. And so in this photo, these are the crew members that I worked with. There are 6 Americans and 4 Russians in this photo. I'm sorry, 7 Americans and 3 Russians in this photo. And we trained together for about a year and a half. My crew and I had to learn to speak Russian because they could not speak any English. And at the time, Russia was so poor, they couldn't afford to hire English teachers or buy English textbooks. So we had to make the effort to learn to speak Russian. And I am not fluent, but to this day, I can still carry on a very poor conversation in Russian. Well, we launched aboard the Space Shuttle Atlantis. So this was my second trip to space aboard Atlantis. And this was our view as we're approaching the Russian Mir space station. And where I docked was this end of the station on a module called Kristall. And there was a docking port on this end that the Russians had intended for their space shuttle to go to. Their space shuttle never flew with humans on board, so it never went to the Mir space station. So we bought the portion of the docking mechanism that we needed from the Russians so that we could fly up and dock with Mir. Just for comparison, this is Soyuz, which means Union in Russian, and this is the vehicle that the Russians fly up and down to and from space in, which is essentially the same vehicle that Yuri Gagarin launched in back in 1961. So in this picture, I'm flying the approach to the space station, and you can see at the top of the photo the docking port on the Mir, and in the forward part of the cargo bay you can just make out a ring, our docking ring, which is about a 4-foot diameter ring. I had to fly Atlantis up and line up the centers of the 2 docking rings within 3 inches. And rendezvous and docking in the space shuttle was manually flown by the mission commander. So I'm flying Atlantis by hand at this point up to the docking. Well, it came off successfully because we had done, I estimate, about 100 dockings in the simulator. So we knew what we were doing, and actually in real life it was easier because the first person view out the windows is a whole lot better than the computer generated images that we had in the simulator. So the docking is actually a little bit easier in real life. We were docked with Mir for 5 days, and we were busy. We actually worked longer than we told Mission Control about. They normally schedule us for a 16-hour workday, and we were working 18 hours a day. So we would say good night to Moscow and good night to Houston and finish up the amount of work that we still had to do. We had more than 400 items that we needed to transfer from the shuttle to the Mir or from the Mir to the shuttle to bring back home. So we were very busy. When it was time for us to leave, it happened to be the 4th of July of 1995. The way we got this photograph, this is about 10 minutes before the undocking. What happened was the 2 cosmonauts that I brought to space to take over the space station, Anatoly Solovyev and Nikolai Budarin, climbed into the Soyuz vehicle, and you can see Soyuz is gone from this end of the station. So they took this photo of the shuttle and the Mir just before we undocked, and that was how we got this photo. And then as we were leaving and separating away. So we remained in orbit. We separated away from the Mir. This is the only time that we ever did a Russian crew changeout using an American spacecraft. So I had brought Anatoly and Nikolai up there, and I picked up Vladimir, Gennady, and Norman to bring them back down to the Earth after they had spent 4 months up there in space. So 2 days later, after this, it was time for us to re-enter. And so what we would do, of course, is close the payload bay doors. We would fire our OMS engines, orbital maneuvering system engines, two 6,000-pound thrust rocket motors, and the deorbit burn would take on the order of about 3 minutes to complete. And that would put us on a trajectory to intercept the atmosphere, and our flight path angle at hitting the atmosphere had to be really precise. It had to be a half a degree down. And at approximately, I think it was 4,000 miles from the touchdown point. And so what a shuttle looked like during reentry was this, of course, 40 degrees nose up, 40-degree angle of attack. And we created this enormous, powerful shock wave in the air. And the temperature in that shock wave would be 6,000 degrees. And of course, that's what the thermal protection system, the tiles and the insulation blankets that the shuttle had all over it, were protecting us from that high temperature in the shock wave. And we wanted a very blunt vehicle to create a very blunt, powerful shock wave, because a blunt, powerful shock wave is that much thicker, so it's that much farther away from the surface of the orbiter. And we would fly surrounded by fire and flame. And this is what it looked like out the windows during a nighttime reentry. It looked like you were flying into a blowtorch. And that fire would last for about 15 minutes in the course of the reentry. And then once we came out of the heating region and got down into the thicker air, at that point we're a glider. And so, of course, we had one chance to land the thing. And so we did a lot of approach and landing training in the airplane that's at the top of this photo, our shuttle training airplane, which was a Grumman Gulfstream II, which had been heavily modified to fly just like a space shuttle. And everyone came back from their first mission aboard the space shuttle, and the commander in the debrief said, it flies just like the shuttle training airplane. Don't change anything. It's just identical to the shuttle training airplane. So that was really excellent training for being able to land the space shuttle. And you had to do it right the first time. You didn't get a second chance. We didn't have any engines left or any fuel. So we couldn't go into holding. We couldn't come around for another approach. You had to do it on the very first try. And all that training really paid off. And then if you've done everything right, you can pose for cool hero photos like this one. The reason there are only 4 of us is that the 3 cosmonauts that we brought back, they get put into rehab when we get them back on the Earth, because after 4 months, they haven't been walking against gravity, and so they need to be rehabilitated back to 1G. And one of my crew members, Dr. Ellen Baker, who's a medical doctor, she was helping with the 3 cosmonauts who had been up there for 4 months on the Mir space station. Well, I'm sure you all know that we retired our space shuttles in 2011. I was disappointed to see that happen. But for the last great many years since then, we have been supporting the International Space Station. And thanks to SpaceX now, we have a way to get our astronauts there ourselves. Prior to that, we were paying the Russians a lot of money for every astronaut that went to the International Space Station aboard the Russian Soyuz vehicles. So fortunately, we can carry our own astronauts up to space now. And I'm sure you all know there is lots of promise for the future. We just in November launched the SLS rocket, the Space Launch System rocket, as part of the Artemis program, which is giving us the ability to send astronauts back to the moon and eventually onto Mars. And the first launch in November was unmanned, but the Orion capsule at the top of the stack went back to the moon, orbited the moon, and actually went quite a ways beyond the moon, and went the farthest away than any human carrying spacecraft has ever gone, and took this kind of spectacular view of the moon and the Earth off in the distance. Artemis 2 is due to launch. You probably know more about it than I do. It was due to launch the end of this year, and I think it has slipped into 2025. But that is our future. And the Artemis program, the SLS rocket, has the capability to send astronauts to Mars. So we're looking forward to that program and that vehicle going on.